Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. The Trump tariffs are perhaps the biggest single shock to international trade since the Second World War. This is why we ask today, is this an opportunity for an equally radical response? Has the time come for India to move away from protectionism and increasingly embrace free trade? That's the key issue I shall discuss today with the former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Mr. Ahluwalia, are the Trump tariffs an opportunity for India to move away from protectionism and embrace free trade, or would that be a mistaken response?
Well, you asked two different kind of questions. I mean, one is you're asked whether this is an opportunity, and the second is whether we should move in that direction. Normally you think of an opportunity as a change in the circumstances which is favorable to you. If you look at the total effect of the Trump tariffs, you really can't call it an opportunity. What he's done is thoroughly disrupted a long established system of multilateral trade, introduced a huge amount of uncertainty, and you've seen the reaction from around the world. The separate issue is what should we be doing? Now, I happen to be one of the people, there are others, who felt that our tariffs were too high. We should have reduced them even earlier. We should even now reduce them. But I wouldn't want to link that to what President Trump has done. I mean, he's done something which reflects his view of what is good for the United States. I don't happen to agree with that. It's going to be not all that good for the US and not good for the world economy. As far as we are concerned, we have to decide in the light of what has happened, what should we do?
What you're therefore saying, and let's not link it to what Trump has done, but you do believe that the time has come for India to drop its protectionist stance, which is its traditional position, and increasingly embrace free trade. You do believe that?
Well, I think free trade is far too broad and categorical. My view, and indeed the view of many economists for the last several years, we should have lowered tariffs. It is true that our tariffs are too high. I don't believe these tariffs were favorable to us. I think, even in the present government, when the Planning Commission was abolished and the Niti Aayog was set up, the first vice chairman of Niti Aayog was Arvind Panagriya, a very distinguished trade economist from Colombia. And he produced a 3-year plan, sometimes back in 2016 or 15, saying that we should continue the established tradition of many previous governments to keep reducing tariffs and go down to the East Asian levels. Now, unfortunately, that advice was not taken. And shortly after, he left, tariffs were raised in a series of steps. So we reversed what we had been doing for some time. And I have been of the view that this was a mistake and we should, in fact, go back to lowering tariffs. Now, to call this as an opportunity, the opportunity was there before all this disruption happened. With all this disruption, while I think it's true that we should remain lowering our tariffs, the benefits that we get from it will get a bit muddied by the global reaction to tariffs themselves.
But
because these are,
nonetheless, you do believe that India should be lowering its tariffs.
yes, I do. And the reason for that, quite honestly, is it's normal when, I mean, I think the bigger players will rightly react to the Trump tariffs by retaliating, or at least that's what they've said. I mean, the European Union has said so, the Chinese have said so, maybe one or two others. Now, these are large players, and if they were to react, the United States would have to recognize that their unilateral measures are leading to some negative effects. If we were to retaliate, it would have no impact because we are not an important trade partner of the United States. So we should look at how's the world moving and what should we do. Now, personally, I think the rest of the world should integrate rather than become protectionist. I mean, if they raise tariffs vis-a-vis the US, that's one thing, but they should be integrating amongst themselves, and we should be integrating with them. I
The
know, for
way to
example,
integrate with them is to reduce tariffs.
yes, absolutely. I mean, look, we are negotiating with the British, we are negotiating with the EU. We should be negotiating with the CPTPP East Asian group of countries, which is led by Japan. And it's quite clear that if the US wants to disrupt the world economy, we should be making sure that we are integrated with the rest of the world economy and sort of sitting with them. Now,
How
whether
far would you go in reducing tariffs? Is there a benchmark that you want to work towards?
Well, you know, when you reduce, let's put it this way, our tariffs at the moment are far too high. And when you join a free trade arrangement, I mean, if we reach an FTA with Europe, if we reach one with EU, there will be a time frame within which tariffs have to be eliminated. Now, whether that's done in 3 years or 4 years, this is a matter of negotiation. I personally think that the belief that tariffs are essential is not actually correct. If there are some specific industries that you want to support and you're willing to, as it were, provide the subsidy for that, there is a role for industrial policy. All countries do that. If there's something you need to do for security reasons, there's always an exemption on security grounds. But otherwise, quite frankly, if we're not competitive, what it means is the exchange rate is not right. And the best way of becoming competitive is to make sure that the exchange rate makes you competitive. I mean,
Let me ask
remember,
you this. To what extent is your belief that we must reduce tariffs, and I take it you mean reduce them fairly substantially, based upon the belief that we have the confidence to compete, that we don't need to protect ourselves, we don't need aatmanirbharta to protect ourselves? To what extent is that the foundation of your position?
let me qualify this in one way. In all these negotiations, agriculture is always kept aside. And the reason for that is that, I mean, both the EU and other countries subsidize their own agriculture quite a bit. So let's keep agriculture aside. Even there, I think there are areas where we can reduce tariffs where they're far too high. And maybe in the negotiations that the Commerce Ministry is undertaking with the Americans, there will be some movement there. But keeping these aside, I don't think that the belief that we are uncompetitive really means that there are certain things which make our products more costly, and we should address those things directly. I mean, if the logistics are bad, let's address the logistics. If there's general lack of competitiveness, the best way of addressing that is to depreciate the exchange rate. I mean, remember what Mr. Trump is saying is that the dollar is too strong. So, frankly, what he wants is other countries should appreciate. He accuses other countries of manipulating their exchange rates to keep them too low because he sees the dollar as, if you like, the reference currency. So, we have to recognize that if we genuinely believe that we are across the board uncompetitive, what that means is that the exchange rate is not competitive and you should
And
make it.
when you proceed to cut tariffs, and as I keep pointing out, cut them fairly substantially, would you do it sector by sector? Would you do it geography by geography? Or would you do it across the board almost in one fell swoop?
Well, you don't have to do it in one fell swoop, but I think you should do it across the board. I do not think it makes sense to have a particular tariff for one country for a product and to have a different tariff for the same country for another product. If you've entered into a free trade agreement, the tariff cuts should, as far as possible, be across the board. They can be staggered. They don't have to be immediately brought down to zero. You normally, in a free trade agreement, you say we're going to reduce these tariffs first, and we're going to bring them down to zero in 3 years or 4 years. This other lot will come a little later in a different range. That's a matter of negotiation. But let's say by the end of 5 years, we should be able to bring tariffs down to an agreed common tariff.
And what would that agreed common tariff likely to be? You mentioned zero a couple of times as an answer. Is that the target you have in mind?
No, I mean, this is something our negotiators would be working on, and the target can never be independent of the exchange rate. I mean, look, some people would say that let's have a modest tariff so you can vary it every now and then. If you have a tariff of 2% or 2.5%, nobody really cares. But even if you had to go for, instead of 2.5%, if you had to go to zero, then any import producer, a producer competing with imports, who feels that he's become uncompetitive because he was okay when the tariff was 2%, but he's not okay when it's 0%, just reduce the exchange rate by 2%. And that's the end of the story.
Let me put to you some of the key concerns that reducing tariffs substantially would give rise to. One, you've already mentioned agriculture. You've said, put agriculture aside, presumably for now, proceed with everything else. But Trump is putting pressure on India to actually drop agricultural tariffs as well. Now, that would affect food security conceivably for up to 800 million people. It would also impinge on the livelihoods of something close to 60% of the population. So how should we respond to the demand from Trump? And perhaps it will be echoed by the European Union to open up India's agriculture, to drop India's tariffs, to accept the produce of agriculture from other countries more easily.
Well, I don't know what they're actually demanding. What I understand in the case of the US is they're particularly interested in access in certain areas, walnuts and pecan and a couple of other
dairy products as well. Dairy products.
Yes, dairy products. I believe with dairy products, there will be phytosanitary problems. Because, in the past, I remember that allowing the import of dairy products has required a certification that the milk from which these dairy products has been made is not produced from cows that have been fed meat extract or beef extract and so on. So that becomes a sort of a phytosanitary religion-based prejudice or preconception, which I don't know what the facts are. But other than that, I mean, if there were there's certainly a range of cheeses, by the way, which you could easily reduce duties, not make it zero duty, reduce duties, which would not affect domestic production. If you go into the market, I mean, Indian Gouda is pretty good and it's available, and foreign Gouda is about 4 times as pricey. So there's a lot of room to reduce tariffs, which would still leave the Indian product pretty competitive.
So there are several agricultural produce or food produce where you would reduce tariffs. You wouldn't have a blanket agricultural ban.
Yes, I mean, let's put it this way. In these matters, fortunately, I'm not negotiating, so I can express the view without making anyone think that that's an Indian position. All negotiators keep a few things up their sleeve. If you were to ask me, I mean, let's say if the negotiators on the other side say, we've got a strong agricultural lobby, they're saying every other developing country is allowing certain categories of agricultural imports. Why aren't you? That's a legitimate point. And I think there are agricultural products where it's not a case of livelihood and hundreds of millions of people. It doesn't relate to food grains. Smaller products which might give a signal of access, which is not a bad idea, and which we could very easily do something with. And we've done it in the past.
Would you say food grains is a complete no-no area?
Food grains, the problem with food grains is that production in the West is hugely subsidized. They've managed to create a system in which their subsidies are said to be exempt from scrutiny and our subsidies are not. Now, we can't subsidize that much anyway. So the notion that for them to say that we are going to massively subsidize our agriculture and then you better allow it to be imported into your country, the Indian farmer would legitimately say, this is not competitive stuff. This is stuff which is coming in cheap because their government is subsidizing them. And I think we need to make that point.
Let me put to you a second concern in reducing tariffs substantially, and that is the strategic danger that Chinese goods could flood the Indian market, increasing India's dependence on a country with which India has difficult relations and therefore increasing India's vulnerability. How do you respond to that concern?
That is an important issue. I don't know, for example, what are the really strategic issues. Look, we are not taking the view that we don't want any imports from China because we're actually trading with China. We want to expand trade with China. So our position is not that no imports from China. On the other hand, there are certain types of very sensitive electronic items, chips, for example, sophisticated chips, where there would be a concern that if the Chinese can hack into whatever system these chips are built into, you would make that whole system vulnerable. Now, I'm not an electronic engineer, but if this is true, and I believe that this is a serious concern, it makes sense to say no Chinese equipment in these areas. That might include telecommunications, space communications, air control, management of the grid, whatever. But other things that are not sensitive, the same thing doesn't apply. So you have to make up your mind, what is it that's sensitive? I think in any trade agreement on national security grounds, you can always introduce an exemption. But that would be a Chinese specific exemption. I mean, you would take a specific action to prevent imports from China on the grounds that national security doesn't allow it.
But you're also saying that it has to be in certain specific areas of Chinese made goods, not across the board.
That is my view, because after all, unless you're saying that our perception of security is no imports from China, that is clearly not our perception. Because if that was the case, you would just ban all Chinese imports, and we're not doing that.
So tell me, would you advocate that India joins the regional free trade groups, like, for example, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP? We opted out, as you know, a few years ago.
Well, I was in favor of RCEP on the grounds that I simply don't buy the notion that India and Indian industry cannot compete with China. We cannot seriously think of India becoming a major superpower, economic power. I don't like the term super, major economic power, and assert that we can't compete with China. However, Indian industry, some more than others, are very concerned that Chinese systems are non-transparent. They're not a market economy. And I think that's a legitimate point of view. That is, the role of the government in China is much, much more intrusive than anywhere else. However, what I think we should do, therefore, is to join the comprehensive trade partnership and whatever prosperity, I forget the exact name, but the CPTPP agreement, which includes Japan, it includes Korea, it includes some of the other East Asian countries, it includes Australia. Britain has just joined that. China is not a member, and it's unlikely that this group will take in China. So this will actually enable us to get free trade access to the major economies of East Asia, not China. We can have a separate bilateral deal with China, sort of saying, well, these are areas where we're happy to trade, and get some bilateral access for them. But the notion...
The danger, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, that if we move towards free trade by substantially reducing our tariffs, we could become victims of dumping.
Look, dumping is always a problem, and it is usually managed by setting up a system where, on the slightest evidence of actual dumping by a particular country, you levy a tariff or countervailing duty on that country. It's never a justification for high tariffs across the board. I mean, for example, there is a serious danger of dumping by China, which everybody is worried about, because if the Americans choke off their market, The Chinese will be left with a huge amount of excess capacity, and they would be quite willing to sell that in the open, in the world market at very, very low prices. Now, some countries may find that beneficial because if somebody is selling you something at a low price, maybe for the next 4 years, as long as excess capacity remains, it's an advantage. Other countries, we might feel that, look, we're building our own capacity and we don't want our producers to be subject to unfair competition. So it makes sense for us to say that, look, we're going to put countervailing duties on Chinese imports. But that doesn't mean we should put countervailing duties on American imports or East Asian imports or other imports. We should be looking to expose our industry to as much competition as possible, which is not unfair.
Now, you've made a very convincing case, and I won't call it free trade, but for substantially reducing tariffs, for making India more accessible to the world to be able to export to. Let me ask you a few connected questions. In a free trade regime or a regime where tariffs have been substantially reduced, what would happen to big industry that's been traditionally mollycoddled with subsidies and protection? Are we suddenly leaving them defenseless?
Well, we are telling them that the time for mollycoddling is over. And if the industries get up and say, look, we've been mollycoddled for 20 years and we want to be mollycoddled for another 20 years, I think you can create a public awareness that this is at the cost of small and medium industry. I mean, let's face it, the big industries in India are producing the major intermediate goods, whether it's steel or aluminum or polyester fiber or rayon fiber or whatever. These are the products that are used by small industry. And the idea of protecting these industries means that small and medium industry cannot get their raw material at the same price that other countries' small and medium industries are getting. I think one of the major reasons for the poor performance of India in exports is that our export strength lies in these medium scale industries, which are in the world market, they're selling to the world market, but they are hampered by having intermediate goods too expensive compared to their competitors. And therefore, I think we should reduce tariffs on the big boys. And, we can offset some of that reduction by having a compensating depreciation in the exchange rate. And that would actually help exporters in addition. So it's a complete win-win.
But you're also indicating that the compensating depreciation in the exchange rate is a concomitant part of your strategy of reducing tariffs.
It's absolutely the case. That is what we did in 1991. I mean, everybody talks about the 1991 reforms as a signal change. The biggest change that was made in 1991 was we got away from the approach that exporters will get duty-free inputs through some complicated licensing procedure and through a series of, I won't go through the details, but through a series of changes, freed up access to these imports at relatively lower duty. We can do the same thing now. It's more complex. The difference now is there are 2 or 3 critical areas. I mean, if we want to be a leader in steel, if we want to be a leader in aluminum, if we want to be leaders in polyester fiber, we need these products to come in at prices comparable to what other people can get them in the world market so that our fabric producers and our garment producers can become competitive. We cannot expect to have a garment industry based on cotton. I mean, the whole world has switched to blended fiber, and our blended fiber is just too expensive.
In this connection, is the production-linked incentive scheme yielding the sort of results we want? Or do you agree with Raghu Ramrajan, who's skeptical and critical of it? And if we lift protection substantially and come closer and closer to free trade, would PLI need to be rethought?
Well, let me say, I don't know enough about what has actually happened. My impression is that there were 1 or 2 critical areas where we wanted PLI. And I mean, I'm generally not averse to a decision by the government that certain sectors need special support for the first 5 years or the first 7 years or something like that. And we have the fiscal space to provide it. What has been unfortunate is that it has been read by every industry as a possibility for itself. So a huge number of people have lined up saying we also want PLI. The PLI benefits that they're getting are very, very small. And furthermore, they're conditional because you get the PLI providing you've done a little bit of indigenization or a certain level of indigenization, which subject to bureaucratic checks later on. And it's a horrendously complicated bureaucratic system, which will just get everybody tied up in knots. So I'm not a great admirer of the PLI scheme, but in selected areas, I mean, for example, if you're talking about chips and you want to make a breakthrough in chip, I would say, for example, in batteries, I mean, we are doing quite well in certain areas of renewable energy. We've set up capacity. If you want to have a major breakthrough in renewable energy, you have to deal with an ability to provide batteries which will actually stabilize the supply. There are many other things also. That will be a new area of production, and it makes sense if we were to say, let's have a PLI for that. The great advantage, by the way, of PLI is that the finance ministry will regulate it. The damage of tariffs is that once they've laid on the tariffs, there's no pressure to remove them. On PLI, there will be pressure because I don't think the finance ministry will be dishing out money year after year if the results aren't evident. And we can leave it to the government then to make up its mind what's working and what's not working.
Let me ask you about two more areas. India has taken a very strong stand on data localization. It wants all Indian data to be stored within India. Has the time come to rethink that?
I wouldn't say necessarily, but that, by the way, that's a new area of trade regulation, and I think we have to recognize that data is something where we have a huge competitive advantage. We're not actually saying that you can't use the data, but we're just saying we don't want this data taken away and put outside India. I think India is large enough that as the country digitalizes and there's a greater growth of available data generated, people will find it feasible to locate data centers in India to manage Indian data. So I don't think that will be a big problem. But even there, we do need to be flexible. And I think we need to do what other countries are doing. So we should watch what others are doing.
In other words, learn from them.
Yes, learn from them, exactly.
What about India's stand on intellectual property rights and in particular patent laws? Is it time for us to be more flexible there? I suppose one issue that comes up fairly often is the evergreening of patents. We don't like that. Should we start to drop our concerns? Or would that affect our generic medicine industry?
That depends a lot in detail and on practice. And what does evergreening mean? It means that when I invent something, a new product, the patent is there for a limited period, okay? When somebody does evergreening, what they do is they make a slight modification in that original formula and then patent the new thing. So I think the question arises, should you give a new patent even for a trivial change, or should you give the new patent only if there's a substantial change? I think it makes sense to demand a substantial change. But let's be clear, even if you give a new patent, the earlier patented product is off patent. So, I mean, if somebody is evergreening, what it's really doing is they're recognizing that the pre-existing patent is no longer patented. Anybody can produce it. So they produce something a little bit different and then use marketing and hype and all that to say, this is much better than the earlier one. Well, maybe you can leave that to the market to determine. You can always, when something is off patent, you can produce the off patent product.
In other words, evergreening is not quite the obstacle and problem that we sometimes in India consider it to be.
Well, I tell you, I think what happens is that most people in the medical area, it's not like buying an apple. I mean, you look at the apple and you maybe take a bite out of it and then you decide. Medical people are then guided by doctors. And the suspicion of those who feel that evergreening is dangerous is linked to the belief that the medical profession too often is persuaded that this medicine really is better and therefore deserves a patent. Now, you can have a situation, by the way, where you have a medicine then you get a little bit better medicine, which is maybe better for people who have, let's say, high blood pressure. Well, you can say that's a small area. Should it be patented? Should it not? I'm not competent to pronounce. But this is a legitimate area, and even in the United States, while the pharma industry is desperately opposed to any opposition to evergreening, there are a lot of people interested in public health in the United States that feel that there's too much gaming going on.
And 40% of American medicines are, in fact, generic imports from India, which means that America also depends upon what India
Yes,
makes and produces
yes,
as a
yes,
result of not accepting
absolutely.
all patents.
Absolutely. And very often you'll find that this is policed by the insurance companies. Where the insurance companies decide that, look, prescriptions should be of generic medicines, not brand names. And if it's a generic product, then it's much cheaper, especially if it's off patent. Our problem here is that a lot of our branded products bring with it a greater assurance of quality, which is missing in the generic patents. And I mean, if we really had good quality control, and all that somebody wanted to be sure about is that, look, this is a good aspirin, and you had quality control that ensured that the generic product is good enough, then I think there'd be no problem. But what you have here is the companies that can ensure quality claim that they have to spend money to ensure quality, but then we put price control on it, so they walk out of that. It's a
Montek
complicated.
Ahluwalia, let me end by going back to the subject I began with, because I think it's important that the message you gave is heard crystal clear as we end this interview. You believe India needs to substantially reduce its tariffs. You don't want to necessarily use the Trump tariffs as an opportunity to do so, because the Trump tariffs are, in fact, the wrong step taken at the wrong time. But that apart, you believe there has been a pressing case for several years, if not longer, for India to reduce tariffs, and we now need to do it because we have the confidence to be able to compete. And where we don't, we need to build the capacity to do so by effectively reducing the exchange rate. I thank you for speaking to me and making your time. Take care. Stay safe.
Thanks, Karan. Always a pleasure.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.